So just very quickly, not to belabor the point, but just to frame up that agriculture is an important source of global greenhouse gas emissions, about 13.5%. About a third of global emissions come from agricultural, forestry, and land use sector. So it's important for us to think about both how we adapt to climate change, but also as a critical solution. Agriculture, also has the potential to both mitigate greenhouse gas emissions while you're working on the core goals of sustainable development and poverty alleviation. So as I think Chris said earlier today, a lot of this work, we're talking about what core programs of Oxfam are already doing to adapt and reduce risk, but we're looking through a different lens, in this case, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that the most vulnerable populations to climate change, obviously, is small farmers, rural poor, women in particular. We've talked a lot about that already. And the bulk of emissions are coming from the fossil fuel industries. I think we all share the frame, the climate justice perspective, that it is fundamentally unjust for smallholders to suffer from a problem that's been created in the North. So I think your climate change advocacy program is really addressing that. At the same time, the longer we wait to mitigate, the more costly adaptation will be, and the more serious the effects on smallholders and rural communities will be. And I think it's important to talk about the ability of Oxfam to communicate in a sophisticated way with the private sector and with policymakers about both adaptation capacity and the mitigation impacts of sustainable agriculture and building adaptive strategies, because they're two sides of the coin. So we know that agriculture and land use management has this unique potential versus fossil fuels and other sources of emissions to mitigate greenhouse gases, and while also increasing the community's ability to adapt. But there's been somewhat of an implementation gap of how we as NGOs, as food companies, buyers, really understand what's the mitigation impact of certain farming practices. We have a lot of global studies. We've seen this morning a really deep dive into regional and crop-specific studies. We're going to talk a little bit about a tool that lets you put in particular farm data and practices and get your carbon footprint. So some of the ways that we'd like to drill down and work a little bit more maybe climate smart when we think about things is have tools that can allow us to quantify the greenhouse gas emissions on a particular farm in a particular region associated with different practices, and then use tools like we saw this morning with CIAT workshops to be able to measure the costs of these practices, the implications, and the trade-off and synergies with other livelihood goals. I'm just going to talk briefly about an initiative within the Sustainable Food Lab, of which Oxfam is a member. We're to use a particular tool that's trying to get at some of these questions called the Cool Farm Tool. It's a farm-level greenhouse gas calculator developed by the University of Aberdeen, who were the authors of the fourth IPCC report, the agriculture chapter, supported by funding from Unilever, to develop a tool that's free, it's open source, and it's meant to be used by agronomists or farmers who have data around their soil and their land uses. The Sustainable Food Lab is piloting the effort to use the Cool Farm tool to look at, from a supply chain perspective, what are the emissions of particular cropping systems. We're working in 21 different farming systems in 15 countries. The three Oxfam sites we heard about this morning are 3 of those. And I think the critical part of this is that we are working in each of these with a supply chain, so that we intend to have the decision makers at the table to say, so here is the particular carbon footprint, here are some of the most promising practices for farmers to lower their carbon footprint. Many of those help them adapt as well. What is your commitment as a buyer to many of these sponsors are large food companies at the table using this tool and in the process with us? What is your commitment to making reduction goals? These are the gaps in technical assistance or financial incentives for farmers to adopt the practices. So we're very much interested in the learning process throughout a supply chain. And I know that you all in different ways in different regions are considering how to engage with the private sector. And I think having a pilot projects like this, and this is another tool you can use in that process. Very quickly, the Cool Farm tool, you can see here what it calculates, basic crop management practices, the sequestration from if you have tree crops or particular land use change, if you take on conservation till or something like that, livestock, field energy use, primary processing, and transport.